Welcome. I'm David Winstead, and welcome to the show In the Know. We have a great guest this morning, Casey Anderson, who's chairman of Montgomery County Planning and been in that job for quite a while now, right?
Almost a decade.
Decade, that's what I thought. But thank you for joining us. You know, this channel is run for the benefit of municipalities in Montgomery County 19 and the residents of the county. So we do programs of interest, and I think your participation and involvement in this is very, very constructive, and we appreciate you taking your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Casey, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. I know you've been chair for a decade and you're in charge of the planning process in Montgomery County, but what did you do before that?
I worked on Capitol Hill. I was a newspaper reporter. Okay. Sometimes I tell people when I grow up I want to be an astronaut or a fireman, but I'm going to try everything else before I get to those career goals. Yeah, I had started a jury consulting firm about 15 years ago, and that kind of brought together my interest in communications and how people form opinions, and strangely, that's really helped me a lot in this job too.
Yeah, I bet.
Really try to understand how people make up their minds and how their perceptions are shaped about whether it's a jury trial or an apartment building going up down the street from their house. And in some ways, there are a lot of similarities.
There are a lot of similarities. I think that's one. I didn't realize. I thought you I knew you were in business. I didn't know that was your role. So tell us a little bit. I think county residents, Montgomery is a very engaged community. But tell us a little bit. How does the board function? How does the planning council function in terms of staff membership and that kind of thing?
We're a little bit unusual because we report to the county council. I'm appointed, and the other 4 board members are appointed by county council members. So we have 9 bosses, and we oversee a staff of about 150 people in planning and about 700 in the parks department. Some people don't realize that the planning board is actually the parks and planning board.
Right.
We have about 37,000 acres of county parkland, 423 parks. So that's a lot of management that has to go into making sure that the parks are acquired, developed, operated, and maintained to everybody's satisfaction, in addition to the work that we do on regulating real estate development and transportation planning.
Right. Excellent. Well, I know, for a long time, Montgomery County has been regarded nationwide as a very thoughtful, strategic and intelligent approach to development. And I know recently the board has considered the 2030 or 2050, Vision 2050. And tell us a little bit about that and what the issues were that you all were debating, the input that you clearly sought from the community. It'd be interesting to understand, because that's just moved out and is at the council now, correct?
That's right. The plan that governs our other plans, the plan of plans, is called the Wedges and Corridors Plan. That was originally adopted in 1964. It was updated slightly in 1969 and 1993, but it hasn't really been comprehensively revised since then. I can't say that we started from scratch, but we did try to update the whole thing with this project that we're calling Thrive Montgomery 2050. And that really builds on the ideas that were in the Wedges and Corridors Plan and the principles that have guided development and the way that we plan in the county for the last 50 or 60 years, but tries to bring them up to date. For example, even though the 1964 plan was written at a time when the March on Washington was going on just down the road in the District of Columbia, that plan doesn't mention racial equity, doesn't allude to anything having to do with race or really even socioeconomic inequality. So that plan served the county well for a long time. It still has a lot of ideas that have held up, but it also had some missing pieces that we're trying to fill in and modernize.
Right. So part of, I know one of the major focuses in the county and with the board is the issue of housing affordability. And, I know for, a long time we've sort of been facing in 2009 with the financial crisis driven by housing and financing of housing, it really dried up everything. I know here in the county, the Maryland Building Industry Association, which represents the home builders, has been trying hard for the last 10 years to kind of regain footing and provide affordable housing, but we're still in sort of a crisis mode in that regard, right? And how do we deal with it? I mean, the developers, the home builders and commercial developers, are to a large extent pretty well funded. There's always money behind real estate, it seems. But how do we deal with that question of, we do have this severe housing crisis, and how do we begin to attract people back in the lower middle income to reside in the county?
Well, that's right. We hit a trough of about 1,000 new housing units, issued building permits, right about 2009, 2010. That was the low point, really, in the post-war history of Montgomery County. We'd routinely see 6,000 to 10,000 units a year during the 80s and into the 90s. Since then, we've bounced back somewhat. We've been at 2,500 to 3,000 units in some of the years where we were coming out of the Great Recession. But since then, that's dipped down below 2,000 units a year for the last couple of years. So meanwhile, we have pretty steady, it's not very strong, job growth and population growth, pretty anemic actually, and that's another thing that concerns all of us. But we have had steady growth. We didn't fall off the cliff like some parts of Florida or Nevada, some of the places that were overbuilt leading up to that period of the Great Recession. So we think in some ways we're fortunate. It's a good problem to have to continue to grow, because it means that Montgomery County and the region are economically dynamic and still attracting economic opportunities, and that's drawing people. But it also means that we have to be concerned about the fact that housing supply has really not recovered from that deep dive that it took at and immediately after the Great Recession. So as far as what we can do about it, I think that there's no one answer. It's going to take a lot of different things. Some of those things are under the control of the government, things like zoning and taxes and fees that go along with development. Some of those things are harder to address because they're not directly under our control. Things like the cost of building materials, access to capital, skilled labor, those sorts of issues.
Which have been a real problem recently with COVID, right? The delay of materials, building materials have had a huge impact.
That's right, that's right. And in fact, after the Great Recession, there was somewhat of a exodus from some of those skilled trades. Some of the people who were in those roles before the Great Recession decided that that was no way to make a living, to be exposed to that kind of economic risk, those ups and downs of the real estate market. So and then you've got issues with things like opioid addiction and other problems that affect the economy generally, but especially the construction industry. And those have made it more difficult, I think, to fully recover.
So a part of, I know, the job and the balance that you try to create in the council is looking at adequate public facilities overall. I mean, not just highway capacity, but schools and that kind of issue. And how do you plan accordingly given available public access and support? What have been, I mean, coming out of COVID, people are now, still beginning to commute again, sort of pre-COVID levels. But how does the county stand up? I heard Mark Elrich, who I know pretty well, talk in frustration one day about the lack of capital funds. And he was asking some of my colleagues about how, if you're constrained on the capital side of the county budget, are there other means to approach? And other counties and other jurisdictions have that. They do more TIFs, transportation infrastructure financing and things like that. But what are the tools that are available now to sort of meet that issue of more adequate public facilities to support both residents and businesses and the needs they have for public infrastructure?
Well, there are quite a few options, but they all boil down to if you don't want to raise taxes on everybody, and you want to try to get the money out of new development, something actually has to get built. So one of the key decisions I think this county council has made was to end the school moratorium that's applied in places where schools are crowded, you couldn't build housing.
Right.
I think that that policy was tried and really failed to deliver the results that were expected over a period of a couple decades. And the council concluded that it was better to see construction proceed and be able to charge the fees on that new development to help pay for the schools. And I think that that policy has been helpful both to the schools and also to get housing going in some of the most desirable parts of the county. As far as other tools, things like TIFs, tax increment financing, where additional tax revenue that's generated by development in a specific area is used to fund infrastructure. I think those sort of things are really, we should be more open to trying them.
Right.
The county has been...
And I think the exec is. I mean, I know he's talked about it, that, you know, there are other tools that other jurisdictions have utilized to address this. So I think that is one that seems to be effective. Prince George's County has it, for example, and they've been able to add density on the transit stations in Prince George's County as a result, or parking capacity, while they took WMATA property close to the transit station for redevelopment, both jobs and residential. They were able to, you know, to use TIFs to provide alternative parking, that kind of thing. That's
right, and I think the county executive is on the right track to be exploring things like transportation tax districts or TIFs or similar types of financing structures. I think the sticking point for him has always been he'd like some more money from new development, but doesn't want anybody to develop anything. So you know, those two things are in tension. And especially when you have a weak real estate market, we're not seeing a lot of construction. Both, I mean, as we discussed, housing starts are way down from historic levels, but the office market is even weaker. So we're trying to find that balance of how can we pay for infrastructure while also making sure that we're not preventing anything from getting built, especially when the mechanisms we're using to get the money are reliant on development and new construction.
Right. So Casey, I think you were in your current position back when Ike Leggett had the Transit Task Force, and I was a part of that group, and we were looking at alternatives. One of them was BRT. There was a group of people in the basically Maryland 355 corridor from Bethesda or North Bethesda up to Rockville that were looking for, you know, an option of a BRT in addition to the transit stations. So that is, what are the other, just real quickly, what are the other key elements of the new plan, the 2050 plan, in terms of transportation?
Well, I should say that we, in parallel with Thrive 2050, we recently have sent a plan to the County Council, and they're just about to finalize it. They've indicated that they have very few changes, so I think that'll be approved just within the next couple of weeks. And that establishes priorities for transit infrastructure in the I-270 corridor. Assuming the managed lanes project, the widening of I-270 and part of the Beltway proceeds, that will include some toll revenue that will be dedicated to transit. So this plan was an effort to try to figure out where should that toll revenue go, in addition to other sources of money for transit projects from the state, federal, or local sources. So that, consistent with what we said in Thrive 2050, it really focuses on trying to make transit a viable way to get around, not just for commuters, not just getting to and from work, but being able to live your life using primarily transit if you want to. That's not to say everybody's going to sell their car, but if you're like me, I mean, I own a car, but I also ride my bike to work regularly. Sometimes
a little further right now than was before.
That's right. I used to live across the street. Now I have a 4 mile. It's good for me. I get some more exercise this way now that I have a bike ride up to Wheaton. But all those things focused us on what to do for the 270 corridor along with managed lanes. And that starts with bus rapid transit, that project we worked on several years ago, and trying to get a bus rapid transit system on 355 all the way really from Bethesda Friendship Heights area all the way up to Clarksburg at some point. But in particular to try to connect Rockville and the Veers Mill corridor up to ideally at least to the Life Sciences Center, to Germantown, eventually to Clarksburg, and then have some supporting express bus services using dedicated lanes, both in that Life Sciences area around the old Bellward Farm and University of Shady Grove, the Life Sciences employment there, and also up in Germantown and Clarksburg to try to connect some of those neighborhoods into the main corridor to provide a really efficient and attractive transit option. Because people don't generally take transit because they want to save the planet or because they're trying to do a nice thing for somebody else who's trying to drive on I-270 and they want to get out of their way. They do it because it makes sense for them. It's an efficient and pleasant way to get where they're going. And also, obviously, it has to run during the times when you need it and come frequently enough that it can be competitive with travel by car. So that plan really focused on trying to move BRT forward in the long run, making improvements to MARC service, and maybe even an extension of the Red Line to Germantown at some point. Probably after you and I are probably long gone.
Well, Casey, we're going to take a quick break. This is David Winstead, and I have Casey Anderson, who's chairman of the Montgomery County Planning Board, and he's got a lot to educate us on in terms of how the county is planning for its future and providing adequate public facilities. And we're going to just take a short break, and we'll be right back.
If you love them enough to crawl into a play place to get them to come down, then surely you'll check nhtsa.gov/the right seat to make sure they're in the right car seat.
Welcome back. This is David Winstead, and I have Casey Anderson, the chairman of the Montgomery County Planning Board. Casey, thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be here.
We were talking, you mentioned it, and I really would like to focus a little bit on it, the business climate issue, the reality of congestion. You know, congestion is a cost. You know, I forget, we used to be, I think, ranked the second highest costly place to live in the Washington metro area. And, you know, the governor, you also are well aware in mentioning the governor's plan called the Traffic Relief Plan for 270 to 70 and looking at HOV lanes. You know, they all have a balance. I personally, having been former Maryland Transportation Secretary, I'm very supportive of the governor's plan. I think that a lot of the planning you all do, the multimodal approach to communities that you take, the pedestrian and the bike safety and all that's a part of it, but also highway capacity is. And I think I'd love to hear, because we haven't chatted about this recently, but don't you feel that has a very important role? I've been told by MDOT and SHA that in the morning peak hour, that those HOV lanes could relieve like 18% of the congestion on a county-wide average basis, and the peak hour, evening commute, as much as 38%. So even though you're paying for the lane, and people could argue from a public policy standpoint that, you know, some people can't afford to pay for the lane, the reality is the benefit accrues across the board, both to the people in the HOV lanes, the hot lanes, as well as the general use lanes. So I would assume, I certainly do, but I would assume that that's a part of the contribution to the county. I mean, we need highway capacity. I do feel candidly that we've watched for a couple decades while Virginia has built highway capacity, and we haven't. And so what's your sense of that? I'd love to hear your perspective on the role of those hot lanes, if you will, and what the governor and MDOT are proposing.
Yeah, well, it's easy for me to say because I don't have to, my name's not on the ballot.
Right.
But I would say we definitely need tolling as that's an important part of, because you're right, congestion is a cost. That's exactly the way to look at it in economic terms. It's not good or evil. It's a cost, and road capacity, like a lot of things, is a scarce resource, and we have to figure out a way to allocate it efficiently. There are certainly concerns about socioeconomic equity of imposing tolls, but I think there are ways to address that. You can, for example, the way that this managed lanes project is structured provides significant investment of toll resources, assuming the project gets built. That toll revenue will partly be dedicated to transit, which serves...
It's a huge chunk. It's like 60 million, 100 million or something?
Well, I don't know if that's a huge trunk in an $11 billion
Okay, maybe
project.
not.
It's like
maybe it's more.
10 million here, 10 million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money, right?
Right. But it could advance some of the visions that you have and the county council and the exec have in terms of looking at more BRT, for example, and appropriate corridors, correct? And,
well, that's
or
right.
adapting roads to have more safe pedestrian and bike path incorporated, right?
Sure, but to your question, I think the main point is that it has redistributive effects that are progressive.
Right.
So the more toll revenue goes to transit, the more that tends to, because transit riders tend to be, certainly bus riders tend to be relatively lower income than drivers in the 270 corridor. That's a progressive facet of allocating toll revenue to transit. So I can't say that I share the concerns about equity that some people have expressed about tolling. I think it's really important part of dealing with transportation investment at a time when we just don't have a lot of resources generally for anything, and we really need to be creative about the way that we're going to raise money for any public infrastructure project. So as I say, that's a little bit easier for me to say than an elected official, but I think it's an important point for people to realize. Right. As far as road capacity versus transit versus biking and walking or anything else, I think the point that is important to take away is that this is not about trying to force anybody to do anything other than whatever it is that they choose to do and what makes sense for them. I think what we're trying to say is that we shouldn't be building everything around the needs of cars. And that's the way that the suburbs were developed.
Right, and it's much more sustainable. I know the county executive introduced, Elrich introduced a climate initiative, and this is part of it. I mean, really looking at emissions and reducing, vehicle miles traveled and that kind of thing. Right?
And what we want is to design communities around people and think about how mobility can best be aligned to serve those human needs. So that means most people are going to continue to drive, but probably we shouldn't blow an interstate right through their neighborhood.
Right.
And that biking and walking should be made a more viable alternative, not just safe, but attractive and convenient, because that will facilitate getting people out of cars, not because they've been forced to do it or because the tolls on the interstate are too high, but because that becomes a more sensible alternative, especially for short trips, which make up the bulk of the trips that most people need. Even if they commute a long distance to get to their job, they still need to get to the grocery store and to the dentist's office and to pick up some cough syrup for their when their children wake up with a cough.
Yeah. Well, Casey, we have seen a remarkable change in sort of lifestyle over the last 2.5 years with COVID. We've had, Montgomery County, I've always said, is extremely fortunate in having, obviously, Walter Reed and NIH, but the FDA and National Cancer Institute, and these huge federal engines that keep, and they're getting increased federal budget. They're not getting cuts like a lot of the more generic agencies on the federal level. But I do know that President Biden is very supportive of telecommuting. I've seen up close and personal in some government buildings that, the utilizations are way down. I mean, we're seeing, for example, GSA has a headquarters down on 17th and F Street, and even now, an average day, they're probably 20 to 25% occupancy, and they consolidated in that. It was a very good move from the standpoint of the federal taxpayer, because what they did is they consolidated out of leased inventory and put everybody in the GSA in one headquarter building on 17th and F Street. But they're 20 or 30% of the people in there. So we really have seen a major shift in lifestyle as a result of COVID. I'm with a law firm, and it's amazing how the lawyers in our firm have adopted to working from home. People prefer it, and they're doing it a lot of the time. I suspect that most people will only work 3 days a week in our law, physically being in the office. So this is having the broadest impact, and because of obviously technology everybody, which I think we did during COVID as an economy, we kept up productivity. You know, people were still, not everybody, but you know, the productivity because of working at home and IT connections and that were. So what, you know, being in charge of planning and having all those people around you that supply you and the board with information, what do you see? I mean, I think in 2022 we're at a period where we're going to continue to see the same level, maybe a little bit less, of working from home and versus being in the office. What are you looking at based on those experiences?
Well, I do think there are some permanent changes. Most of them are acceleration or that changes that were already underway have been catalyzed or accelerated by the pandemic. For example, a grocery delivery and Amazon.
Right.
Have obviously, those were not invented
the
during
roof.
the pandemic,
Right.
but this has reinforced some of those trends and put a lot of pressure on more conventional brick and mortar retail. Other grocery store chains even have had to respond to Amazon's integration of online delivery with even the brick and mortar side of the grocery business. So that's reinforced some of those pre-existing direction that was where we were already headed. And similarly, I think it has certainly cemented telework, and it has led some employers, including us, to reconsider. We're going to go to 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week off. Although I think that the predictions that this would lead everybody to work remotely, and so you could move to Montana and telecommute to your job in DC are not really hitting the mark. There's a huge difference between having to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week and not being in the office at all. So if you have to be at your law firm downtown in DC 3 days a week, you probably can't move to Montana. That's not going to work. Maybe you'll be able to live a little further out, but what we've seen in terms of housing trends is that in some ways the more urban light locations, like what we have, not just Bethesda, Silver Spring, transit-oriented, close-in suburban downtowns, but even something like Park Potomac, which is the Folger Pratt project right off of Exit 4.
Which isn't right on Metro, but it's right.
It's got no transit. It's not transit accessible, but it's in a funny way, it is urban. It's a mix of uses. It's there's some high-rise residential and some townhouses around grocery and some retail, some restaurants, those sorts of things. And I think we're seeing that can be in some ways more appealing, because if people don't feel they really need to be in the city, or they don't like that idea, but they want the convenience that is associated with having everything right there. They don't necessarily want to buy a 5-acre plot in Potomac and build a McMansion. So I think that there are real and lasting effects on choices about housing type and location, but they may not be quite as dramatic or play out in quite the same way that some people were predicting early on in the pandemic. I know that we feel that it's important to get people in the office, and in my experience dealing with other white-collar employers, law firms, accounting firms, professional services firms, they still feel that they need their people together. There's something that's not quite replicated.
Architecture firms, for example.
People who are collaborating and exchanging ideas, and where person-to-person communication, especially spontaneous, water cooler type conversations are really important. But I think that there will be continued softness in the office market, both because the pandemic has reduced the need to give everybody an office, and it may be that employers, like United Therapeutics was already telling employees, hey, you can have a file drawer here that you can keep your belongings in, but if you're not going to be in the office every day, you don't have an office with a desk where you put up the pictures of your family and your diplomas and all those sort of things. You can put all your things in this drawer, and then when you come in 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, you can take the things that you need to do your work out of that drawer, and then tomorrow when somebody else is in and you're at home, they're going to be sitting at that desk. So there will definitely be effects on office space, but I think that the enduring value of being close to other people with
yeah,
skills
collaboration.
and knowledge and ideas.
Yeah.
That's important. I mean, I always tell people if it were really true that high costs, congestion, all the things that aggravate people about cities were really the fundamental driver of economic competitiveness, or the lack thereof, then Amazon would have put its second headquarters in Mississippi. But instead, they picked one of the most congested, expensive, difficult places to do business.
And benefit to Maryland. I mean, even though it's not
States.
located here.
That's right.
So, Casey, one question you mentioned earlier about, and your commitment, I know professionally because I've watched you here for a number of years, you know, you have a commitment to making things as efficient as possible at Park and Planning. You know, making sure, and I know you got a very talented group of people. I've been exposed and dealt with them for a long, long time. But what have you done, and how important is it to economic development in the county? The sense of the process of approvals, the zoning process, the things that you work on daily and your staff work on. What have you done to improve the process, to speed it up so that when you're looking at Virginia as competition, or DC as competition, or Pennsylvania, that a developer, you know, will look at the region and say, I can do business in Montgomery County, I can bring my jobs here, I can build, you know, my commercial enterprise here. What's happened in recent years? I know you've been committed to this, but talk a little bit about what you've been able to do to sort of move the process and also to contribute to more jobs in growing here, staying here and growing here.
Well, we've made a lot of specific changes to our rules to try to streamline the development process, but I think the most important thing is the way that we look at our role. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the job of land use regulation was to answer the phone. So somebody would call and say, I want to build an office building, I want to build housing, I want to build a restaurant, I want to build some kind of real estate project. And our role was to say, okay, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to jump through these hoops, and we want to make sure that you're paying into the system for schools and roads and water and sewer and all the other public infrastructure. And we still have to do that. We still have to play that regulatory role. But our role has also become much more about economic development and competitiveness, not just about regulation.
Right.
And I think I would compare this to if you were running a company and you went to Wall Street, you're trying to have an initial public offering. You're going to be pitching investors. You want to persuade them. You're going to say, give us your money. We want your money. You will be happy that you invested in Montgomery County. We're not here to rake you over the coals. We're here to pitch you on why this is a great place to do business. It's why you're going to find employees here that are productive, that are the best people that you can find. We want you to be here. We want to persuade you to come. That doesn't mean that you give them everything or give away the store. Just as if you were making a business deal, you have to make sure that that makes sense for both sides to a transaction. But it means that our role as a regulator is to very unapologetically say, we want you here, and we want to encourage development because housing is infrastructure. It is the infrastructure that puts a roof over people's heads.
Casey, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate you taking your time as well as your professional commitment that you work for the entire county and all the residents of the county. So thanks again for coming.
Thanks very much, David. It's great to see you.
We've had Casey Anderson, who's chairman of the Montgomery County Planning Board, talking to us about their role in making our community livable and prosperous, and we thank you for joining us again on the program In the Know.